Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's David Chen. I had just turned 42 when we arrived at the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. And it was the worst mistake of our lives. My brother Jake and I had been planning this RV trip for months. After our father passed away in March, we'd both thrown ourselves into work to avoid dealing with the grief. I buried myself in my accounting firm in Denver, while Jake doubled down on his research at the University of Colorado, studying migratory bird behavior. By October, we were both burned out and desperately needed to reconnect. "Remember when Dad used to take us camping?" Jake had said during one of our rare phone calls. "Before Mom got sick, before everything went to hell, we should do that again, just the two of us." The idea of a brother's trip appealed to me. We'd rented a 35-foot Winnebago Forza and planned a route through the Southwest, hitting national parks and wildlife refuges. Our last stop was supposed to be Bosque del Apache in New Mexico, famous for its sandhill crane migration. Jake was particularly excited about the photography opportunities. "The refuge is incredible in November," he'd explained as we drove south from Colorado. 30,000 sandhill cranes, plus snow geese, ducks, raptors. It's one of the premier birding destinations in North America. I wasn't much of a birder myself, but I enjoyed Jake's enthusiasm. At 38, he was 4 years younger than me, but had always been the more adventurous one. While I'd chosen a safe career in finance, he'd pursued his passion for wildlife biology, spending months in remote locations studying animal behavior. The drive to Bosque del Apache took us through stunning high desert country. We followed the Rio Grande Valley south from Santa Fe, past ancient volcanic escarpments and cottonwood bosques that were just beginning to turn golden with autumn. The landscape was vast and empty, painted in shades of rust and ochre that stretched to distant mountains. "Look at that sky," Jake said, pointing through the windshield at the endless blue dome above us. "You can see forever out here." No wonder the early astronomers loved this part of the country. We reached the refuge in late afternoon, driving through the entrance station and past the visitor center to the campground. The RV sites were scattered among mature cottonwoods along the Rio Grande, with spectacular views of the Chupadera Mountains to the west. Only a few other rigs were visible in the off-season quiet. "This is perfect," I said as we maneuvered the Winnebago into a site near the river. "Peaceful, isolated, great views. Dad would have loved this place." Jake was already unpacking his camera equipment, multiple telephoto lenses and a tripod that cost more than most people's cars. "The light's going to be incredible for sunrise photography. The cranes roost in the shallow ponds and take off just after dawn. It's supposed to be one of the most spectacular wildlife displays in North America." We spent the evening setting up camp and planning the next day's birding itinerary. Jake showed me maps of the refuge's auto tour route, pointing out prime viewing locations and explaining the behavior patterns of the various species we might encounter. "The interesting thing about sandhill cranes," he said over dinner, "is their intelligence. They're incredibly social, with complex communication systems and family structures that persist for years. Some researchers think they might even have primitive forms of culture, learned behaviors passed down through generations." "Sounds almost human," I said. "In some ways, they're more sophisticated than humans. Their migration patterns have remained consistent for thousands of years. They return to the exact same roosting sites, follow the same flight paths, maintain the same social hierarchies. There's a stability to their world that human society lacks." As darkness fell, we built a small fire in the campground's fire ring and opened a bottle of bourbon Jake had been saving for the trip. The night was clear and cold, with stars beginning to emerge in the desert sky. From somewhere across the wetlands, we could hear the distant calls of cranes settling in for the night, a wild, primitive sound that seemed to echo from the dawn of time. "You know what Dad always said about places like this," Jake said, staring into the fire, "that they were windows into the past. places where you could still experience the world the way it was before humans changed everything. I nodded, thinking about our father's love of wild places and his frustration with humanity's impact on the natural world. He'd been an environmental lawyer, fighting losing battles against developers and polluters for 30 years. The cancer that killed him seemed almost fitting, a disease born from the same toxic world he'd spent his life trying to protect. Around 10 o'clock, we heard the first screams. They came from somewhere out in the wetlands, high-pitched and anguished like an animal in terrible pain. Jake looked up from his bourbon, head tilted to listen. "Coyote, maybe," I suggested. "Doesn't sound right for coyote," he said. "Could be a great horned owl. They can make some pretty disturbing sounds." The screaming continued for several minutes, joined by other voices, a chorus of anguish that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The sounds weren't quite animal, but they weren't human either. They occupied some unsettling middle ground that made my skin crawl. "Jesus," I muttered. "What is that?" Jake stood up and walked to the edge of our campsite, looking out toward the dark wetlands. "I've never heard anything like it. It's almost like the cranes are in distress, but they don't usually vocalize at night unless something's threatening them." The screaming gradually faded, leaving us in silence that felt heavier than before. Even the normal night sounds, cricket song, wind in the cottonwoods, the distant murmur of the river, seemed muted now. "Probably just territorial disputes," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Wildlife refuges can get crowded during migration season. Competition for roosting sites, that sort of thing." We finished our drinks and went to bed around 11, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear something. Distant, splashing from the wetlands, wing beats passing overhead, soft calls that didn't match any bird I'd ever heard. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were filled with vast flocks of something circling overhead, their shadows blocking out the sun. I woke before dawn to the sound of Jake moving around in the front of the RV. Through the bedroom window, I could see him silhouetted against the pre-dawn glow, setting up his camera equipment for the sunrise crane departure. "You're up early," I said, stumbling out to join him. "Best light of the day," he replied, adjusting his telephoto lens. "The cranes should start moving any minute now." I made coffee while Jake focused on his photography, scanning the wetlands through his viewfinder for signs of crane activity. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the Sandia Mountains in shades of pink and gold. "There," Jake said suddenly. "Movement in the North Pond." I looked where he was pointing and saw dark shapes stirring in the shallow water about a quarter-mile away. As the light improved, the shapes resolved into hundreds of sandhill cranes, tall gray birds with distinctive red crowns, standing motionless in the wetland like ancient sentinels. "Why aren't they moving?" I asked. "I thought you said they take off at sunrise." "They usually do," Jake said, his eye pressed to the camera viewfinder. "But something's wrong. Look at their posture. They're all facing the same direction, but they're not preparing to fly. They're watching something." I followed his gaze across the wetland and felt a chill run down my spine. The cranes were indeed all facing the same direction, their long necks extended and their heads turned toward something in the distance. But more disturbing was their absolute stillness. Not one bird moved, not even to preen or shift position. They stood like gray statues in the golden water, locked in perfect, unnatural synchronization. "That's not normal behavior," Jake said, lowering his camera. "Cranes are social, but they're also individuals. You never see this kind of uniform response unless there's an immediate threat. Maybe a predator? What predator could threaten that many cranes at once? And why aren't they flying away?" As we watched, more cranes began to emerge from other parts of the wetland. They moved with the same eerie synchronization, wading through the shallow water to join the growing congregation. Within minutes, there were thousands of them, all facing the same direction, all maintaining that unnatural stillness. "I need to get closer," Jake said, shouldering his camera bag. "This could be some kind of undocumented behavior. Maybe they're responding to infrasound, or electromagnetic changes, or—" "Jake, wait." Something about the scene made me deeply uneasy. Maybe we should stay here and observe from a distance. From here, I can't tell what they're looking at. I need to understand what's causing this response." Before I could argue further, Jake was walking toward the wetland, camera in hand. I watched him pick his way along the muddy shore, trying to get a better angle on the congregated cranes. The birds didn't react to his approach. They remained focused on whatever had captured their attention in the distance. Jake had been gone about 10 minutes when I heard him shout, "David, you need to see this." His voice carried clearly across the morning air, but there was something wrong with it. An edge of panic that I'd never heard from my normally unflappable brother. I grabbed binoculars and jogged toward the wetland, following the path Jake had taken. I found him standing at the edge of a large pond, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. He was staring across the water with an expression of horror and fascination. "Look," he said, pointing toward the far shore. I raised the binoculars and adjusted the focus. At first, I saw only more cranes standing in their eerily synchronized formation. But as I scanned across the congregation, I began to notice details that made my blood run cold. Some of the cranes weren't birds at all. Mixed in with the genuine sandhill cranes were shapes that were almost right, but subtly wrong. They had the same general size and posture, the same gray coloration, but their proportions were off. Necks that were too long, legs that bent at impossible angles, wings that hung at unnatural positions. "What am I looking at?" I whispered. "I don't know," Jake said. At first I thought they were sick birds, maybe affected by some kind of disease. But look closer. Look at their faces. I adjusted the binoculars again, focusing on the nearest of the wrong-looking shapes. What I saw made me stagger backward. The thing had a vaguely crane-like head, but where the bird's face should have been was something else entirely. Human features, but stretched and distorted, as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face from memory and gotten the proportions wrong. Eyes that were too large, a mouth that split too wide, skin that was pale and waxy under the gray feathers. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. "Those aren't birds." "Some of them are," Jake said, his voice unnaturally calm. "But some of them are something else. Something that's trying to look like birds." I scanned across the congregation again, and now I could see them clearly. Dozens of the false cranes scattered throughout the flock. They maintained the same synchronized stillness as the real birds, but their mimicry was imperfect. Small details gave them away. Feathers that didn't quite lie right, movements that were slightly too fluid, shadows that fell at the wrong angles. "We need to leave," I said, "right now." "Wait." Jake raised his camera and started taking pictures. "This is incredible. I don't know what this is, but it's the discovery of a lifetime." "Jake, don't." The camera's shutter sound carried clearly across the water, and at that exact moment, every single crane, real and false, turned to look at us. Thousands of eyes fixed on our position with perfect, terrifying precision. The real cranes showed typical bird wariness, ready to take flight at the first sign of threat. But the false ones looked at us with something that could only be described as intelligence. Ancient, patient, hungry intelligence. "Run," I said. "David, this is—" "Run." Jake must have heard something in my voice that convinced him, because he suddenly lowered his camera and sprinted toward the RV. I was right behind him, crashing through riverside vegetation and stumbling over hidden roots. Behind us, I could hear the sound of thousands of wings taking flight, but not all at once, as would be natural. Instead, they rose in waves as if following some coordinated plan. We reached the Winnebago, and I immediately started the engine while Jake threw his equipment inside. Through the windshield, I could see dark clouds rising from the wetlands, massive flocks of cranes spiraling into the morning sky. But mixed in with the natural bird formations were other shapes, things that flew with too much purpose, too much coordination. "Drive," Jake said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Drive now." I pulled out of the campsite and headed for the refuge exit, trying to keep my speed reasonable on the narrow park roads. In the rearview mirror, I could see the crane flocks following us, maintaining position about half a mile back. "They're tracking us," Jake said, looking through the rear window. "Birds don't track vehicles," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't entirely true, not in this case. We reached the main entrance and I turned onto the highway, hoping to leave whatever was happening behind us. But as we drove north along the Rio Grande Valley, the flocks maintained their pursuit. They stayed high and distant, but they were definitely following our route. "What do you think they are?" I asked. "I don't know," Jake said, reviewing the photos on his camera's LCD screen. "But look at this." He showed me one of the images he'd captured, a close-up of one of the false cranes. In the high-resolution photo, the thing's human-like features were even more disturbing. The eyes were definitely human, but filmed over with a gray membrane. The mouth was filled with too many teeth, arranged in rows like a shark's. "That's not natural evolution," I said. "That's something else entirely. Could be some kind of parasitic organism," Jake suggested. "Something that takes over birds' bodies and uses them as camouflage. There are fungi that do similar things to insects, control their behavior, alter their appearance. Since when do parasites give their hosts human faces?" Jake didn't have an answer for that. We drove in tense silence for the next hour, constantly checking the mirrors for signs of pursuit. The crane flocks had fallen back somewhat, but they were still visible on the horizon, dark smudges against the morning sky. Around 10 o'clock, we stopped for gas in the small town of San Antonio. As I filled the tank, Jake went inside to buy snacks and ask the clerk about local wildlife behavior. He came back looking pale. "What did you find out?" I asked. "The clerk says this happens every few years. The crane's behavior gets weird for a few days, then everything goes back to normal. She says the old-timers call it the hunger, some kind of natural cycle that affects the local wildlife." "Did she say anything about the cranes looking different?" I asked about that. She gave me a strange look and said I should talk to her grandfather. He's lived here all his life, remembers stories from before the refuge was established. Against my better judgment, we drove to the address the clerk had given us, a small adobe house on the outskirts of town. The old man who answered the door looked to be in his 80s, weathered by decades of high desert sun. When Jake explained what we'd seen, his expression grew serious. "Hambrientos," he said in Spanish. "The hungry ones? My grandfather told me about them when I was young." "What are they?" I asked. "Old things," he said, switching to accented English. "Things that were here before the Spanish, before the Pueblo people, maybe before humans altogether. They sleep most of the time, deep in the earth or in hidden places, but every few years they wake up hungry." "Hungry for what?" "Life," he said simply. "They feed on life force, consciousness, whatever makes a thing alive. But they're weak when they first wake up, so they hide inside animals, use them as, how do you say, disguises." Jake leaned forward. "You're saying these things possess animals?" "Not possess exactly, more like wear them, like putting on clothes. The animal dies, but the body keeps moving, keeps looking alive. And while they wear it, they learn about it, understand how to be it better." A chill ran down my spine. "How long does this last?" "Until they've fed enough to take their true forms," the old man said. "Then they don't need the animal bodies anymore. Then they hunt as themselves." "What do they really look like?" Jake asked. The old man shrugged. "Nobody knows. Anyone who sees their true form doesn't come back to tell about it. But the stories say they're tall, thin, with too many joints in their arms and legs, and they're always hungry. Always." We thanked him and left, but his words haunted us as we drove back toward the highway. The crane flocks were still visible in the distance, still following our general direction of travel. "You don't actually believe him, do you?" I asked Jake. "I don't know what to believe," he replied. "But those photos, whatever those things are, they're not natural. And the way they all moved in perfect coordination, the way they all turned to look at us at the same time." He trailed off, staring at his camera's LCD screen. "David, pull over." "What?" "Pull over. Look at this." I found a wide spot on the shoulder and stopped the RV. Jake handed me his camera, pointing to a particular photo on the screen. It was one of the wide shots he'd taken of the entire crane congregation. "Count them," he said. I looked at the image, trying to count the individual birds. There had to be thousands, packed together in the shallow water. I can't get an exact count, Too many to look at the false ones, the ones with human faces. Count those. I studied the photo more carefully, picking out the shapes that didn't belong. It took several minutes, but eventually I arrived at a number. 47, I said. Now look at this one. He showed me another photo, taken a few minutes later. Count again. I went through the same process, identifying the false cranes and counting them carefully. 53. They're multiplying, Jake said quietly. Whatever they are, they're creating more of themselves. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If these things could somehow convert real cranes into false ones, they were essentially viral, capable of exponential growth under the right conditions. We need to report this, I said. Fish and Wildlife Service, maybe the CDC. Someone needs to know about this. Report what, exactly? That we saw some birds that looked weird? That we think there might be shape-shifting parasites in a national wildlife refuge? They'll think we're crazy. He had a point, but I couldn't just ignore what we'd witnessed. Then we need better evidence. More photos, video, maybe samples. No. Jake's voice was firm. Absolutely not. We're not going back there. Jake, David, listen to me. I've spent my entire career studying animal behavior, and what we saw today violates everything I know about biology. Those things moved with purpose, with coordination that's impossible for wild animals. And they're spreading. Every minute we waste talking about it, they're creating more of themselves. I looked at the camera again, studying the false cranes in the photos. Their human-like eyes seemed to be looking directly at me, even through the digital image. So what do? We run, Jake said. We get as far from here as possible and hope they don't follow us. But even as he spoke, I could see dark shapes moving across the sky to the south. The crane flocks were still out there, still tracking us somehow, and they were getting closer. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, pushing the Winnebago's speed up to 70 miles per hour. The vehicle wasn't designed for high-speed travel, and I could feel it swaying in the desert crosswinds. But I didn't dare slow down. They're gaining on us, Jake said, watching the side mirror. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw what he meant. The crane flocks were flying faster now, their formations more compact and purposeful. They were definitely tracking our movement, adjusting their flight path to match our route along the highway. This is impossible, I muttered. Cranes don't fly this fast. They can't maintain this kind of pursuit over long distances. Those aren't cranes anymore, Jake said. Not entirely. We drove for another hour, the landscape blurring past in a haze of red rock and sagebrush. The pursuing flocks gradually fell back, but they never disappeared entirely. They maintained a constant presence on the horizon, like vultures circling a dying animal. Around noon, we reached the outskirts of Socorro. I was considering stopping for lunch when Jake suddenly grabbed my arm. "Don't stop," he said urgently. "Keep driving." "Why?" He pointed toward the town. "Look at the power lines." I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. Every power line, every telephone pole, every elevated surface in the town was covered with birds. Thousands of them perched in perfect silence, all facing the highway, all watching our approach. "They're not all cranes," Jake said, raising his binoculars. "Ravens, hawks, vultures, even songbirds. All just waiting." As we drove through the town, the birds turned their heads to track our passage. The movement was perfectly synchronized, like a wave passing through the entire population, and mixed in with the genuine birds were others. Shapes that were almost right but subtly wrong. Creatures wearing feathered disguises that didn't quite fit. "They're spreading to other species," I said, "taking over the entire local bird population." "It's accelerating," Jake agreed. "Whatever this phenomenon is, it's growing exponentially." We cleared the town and continued north on Interstate 25, but now I could see birds gathering along the entire route. They perched on fences, power lines, billboards, all of them maintaining that unnatural stillness, all of them watching the highway with two intelligent eyes. "We need to get off the interstate," I said. "Try to lose them on back roads." "Good idea. Take the next exit." I turned onto a smaller highway heading west into the mountains. The road climbed steadily through pinon and juniper forests, winding between red sandstone cliffs and deep arroyos. For a while, we seemed to have left the birdwatchers behind, but as we crested a ridge, Jake let out a curse. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. The road descended into a broad valley, and every tree in the valley was black with perched birds. They covered the landscape like a living carpet, thousands upon thousands of them, all perfectly still, all watching the road. "Turn around," Jake said. "Now." I tried to execute a three-point turn on the narrow mountain road, but the Winnebago was too long and the space too confined. As I struggled with the maneuver, the birds began to move. They didn't fly. They flowed. Like a black tide, they poured down from the trees and across the valley floor, moving toward our position with supernatural coordination. And as they got closer, I could see that many of them weren't birds at all anymore. They were tall, thin creatures that moved on too many joints. Their gray skin stretched tight over elongated bones. They wore fragments of feathers like tattered clothing, but underneath was something far older and more alien than any earthly animal. "Go, go, go!" Jake shouted. I floored the accelerator and the Winnebago lurched forward down the mountain road, directly toward the approaching horde. The creatures scattered as we approached, but they didn't flee. They repositioned, flowing around us like water around a stone. Some of them leaped onto the RV's roof, their clawed feet scrabbling for purchase on the metal surface. Others paced us on the ground, loping alongside the vehicle with fluid, inhuman grace. Through the windows I could see their faces, pale, elongated, with eyes that held vast and patient hunger. "The tire!" Jake yelled. I looked in the side mirror and saw one of the creatures crouched beside the rear wheel, its clawed hands extended toward the spinning rubber. If it damaged the tire, we'd be stranded in the middle of this nightmare. Without thinking, I swerved hard to the right, throwing the creature off balance. It tumbled away from the wheel but immediately scrambled back to its feet, apparently uninjured by the fall. We broke free of the main group and raced down the mountain road, the engine straining under the load. Behind us, the creatures gave chase for several miles before finally falling back. But I knew they weren't giving up. They were regrouping, preparing for another attempt. "We can't outrun them forever," I said. "That RV's not built for this kind of punishment." "I know," Jake said. "But what else can we do? We can't fight them, we can't hide from them, and apparently we can't escape them either." The fuel gauge was approaching quarter tank, and we were in the middle of nowhere with no gas stations visible. If we ran out of fuel, we'd be completely at their mercy. "There," Jake said, pointing to a sign ahead. "Pueblo ruins. Maybe we can find shelter there." The sign indicated a small archaeological site about 2 miles off the main road. It wasn't much, but it was our only option. I turned onto the dirt access road and followed it to a small parking area beside the ruins. The site consisted of several partially reconstructed Pueblo buildings arranged around a central plaza. Ancient walls rose from the desert floor, their adobe construction weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Interpretive signs described the lives of the people who had built this place 800 years ago. "Why here?" I asked as we parked near the ruins. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "But these creatures, whatever they are, they seem old, maybe older than human civilization. Places like this, there might be some kind of protection here, some knowledge the ancient people had about dealing with them." It was a desperate hope, but we were out of other options. We grabbed emergency supplies from the RV and made our way into the ruins, looking for the most defensible position we could find. We ended up in what had once been a ceremonial chamber, its circular walls rising about 10 feet high. The space was small enough that we could watch all the entrances, and the ancient stonework felt solid and protective. As the sun began to set, we could hear them coming. It started as a distant rustling, like wind through dry leaves. But gradually the sound grew louder and more complex, the scraping of claws on stone, the whisper of movement through shadows, the soft calls of things that were almost but not quite birds. "They've found us," Jake whispered. Through gaps in the ancient walls we could see shapes moving in the gathering darkness. The creatures had shed their feathered disguises entirely now, revealing their true forms. They were tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at joints no human body possessed. Their skin was pale gray, stretched tight over elongated bones, and their faces were vaguely human but wrong in every detail. They moved through the ruins with fluid grace, exploring every shadow, testing every possible entrance. But they didn't approach our chamber directly. They circled it, always staying just beyond the walls, as if there were some invisible barrier they couldn't cross. "Look at the symbols," Jake said, pointing to markings carved into the chamber walls. I followed his gaze and saw ancient petroglyphs spiraling around the circular space. Images of birds, humans, and stranger things that might have been representations of the creatures now stalking us. But the bird symbols were different from modern representations. They showed creatures with too long necks, too many joints, faces that were almost human. The ancient people knew about them, I realized. They built this place as protection. Or as a prison, Jake said quietly. The creatures continued their circling for hours, occasionally testing the edges of whatever force kept them from entering the chamber. Sometimes they would call to us in voices that were almost human, speaking words in languages I didn't recognize. Around midnight, they tried a different approach. One of the creatures appeared at the chamber entrance, but this one looked different from the others. It was smaller, more human in proportion, and it wore clothing. Tattered jeans and a hiking shirt that looked familiar. "Help me," it said in a voice I recognized. "Please, I'm lost. I've been wandering out here for hours." My blood ran cold as I realized I was looking at a perfect replica of Jake. Not the Jake sitting beside me, but Jake as he might look after days of exposure and dehydration. The creature had somehow created a copy, complete down to the smallest details. "Don't listen to it," the real Jake whispered. "It's trying to trick us into leaving the chamber." The false Jake continued pleading, describing being separated from his brother during a hiking accident, begging for help finding his way back to their campsite. Its voice was perfect, down to the slight Colorado accent Jake had picked up in college. "Please, David," it said. "I know you're in there. I'm hurt. I need your help." Other creatures began to appear, taking on familiar forms. I saw my father, looking exactly as he had during our last camping trip together 5 years ago. I saw my ex-wife, my college roommate, childhood friends I hadn't seen in decades, all of them pleading for help, all of them trying to lure us out of the protective circle. "How do they know?" I asked Jake. "How do they know what these people look like?" "They read us somehow," Jake said. "Pulled the images from our memories when they first made contact. That's why they were able to mimic the cranes so perfectly. They studied them first, learned everything about their behavior and appearance." The parade of false humans continued throughout the night. The creatures were patient, methodical, trying every psychological approach they could think of. They showed us loved ones in distress, authority figures demanding compliance, even versions of ourselves claiming to have found a way to escape. But we held firm, staying within the ancient chamber as dawn gradually approached. When the first rays of sunlight touched the ruins, the creatures melted away like shadows, retreating to whatever dark places they inhabited during daylight hours. "Are they gone?" I asked. Jake peered cautiously over the chamber wall. "For now, but they'll be back tonight." We spent the day exploring the ruins more thoroughly, looking for clues about how the ancient people had dealt with these creatures. The petroglyphs told a story of periodic visitations, times when the star-hungry ones would emerge from the earth to feed on the living. But they also showed rituals, protective symbols, ways of binding the creatures to specific locations. In the largest building, we found a chamber filled with pottery shards decorated with the same protective symbols we'd seen carved into the walls. And buried beneath a layer of sand and debris, we discovered something that made my heart race with hope. "Of bones," Jake said, carefully excavating a partial skeleton. "Human bones, but look at the positioning." The skeleton was arranged in a specific pattern, arms and legs positioned to mirror the protective symbols carved into the walls, and scattered around it were the remains of the creatures, gray, elongated bones that crumbled to dust at our touch. "It's a binding ritual," I realized. Someone sacrificed themselves to trap the creatures here. to prevent them from spreading beyond this location. But if that's true, Jake said slowly, then our presence here might have broken the binding. By bringing them to this place, we might have freed them. The implications were terrifying. If these creatures had been contained here for centuries, and our arrival had somehow released them, then we were responsible for whatever happened next. They would spread beyond the refuge, taking over bird populations across the southwest, eventually moving on to larger animals and possibly even humans. We have to stop them, I said. How? We're two guys with no weapons, no special knowledge, no protection except for these old walls. The binding ritual. If it worked once, maybe it can work again. Jake looked at the arranged skeleton, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're talking about human sacrifice, about one of us staying here to reset the binding. I'm talking about doing whatever it takes to prevent these things from spreading across the continent. We spent the rest of the day studying the petroglyphs and bone arrangements, trying to understand the specifics of the binding ritual. It seemed to involve specific positioning, timing based on astronomical events, and ultimately the willing sacrifice of a human life to power the containment spell. As the sun began to set, we made our decision. It should be me, Jake said. This is my field, my area of expertise. I understand what's happening here better than you do. No, I said firmly. You have work to finish, research that could help other people understand these phenomena. I'm just an accountant. My death would be more useful than my life. David. Besides, I interrupted. Dad always said family meant protecting each other. If one of us has to stay, it should be the older brother. The creatures began to appear as darkness fell, emerging from crevices and shadows throughout the ruins. They moved with more confidence tonight, as if they sensed that their prey was weakening, that escape was becoming impossible. But instead of hiding in the protective chamber, we emerged to meet them. I positioned myself in the center of the plaza, arranging my body to match the pattern we'd seen in the buried skeleton. Jake stood at the edge of the ruins, ready to document what happened and carry word to the outside world. The creatures approached cautiously, sensing that something had changed. The largest of them, the one that seemed to be their leader, stopped about 10 feet away and studied me with those ancient, hungry eyes. You understand, it said in a voice like wind through dry bones. You know what must be done. I understand, I said. Take what you need, but the binding holds. You don't leave this place. The creature smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed in the starlight. You misunderstand, little human. The binding was never about sacrifice. It was about invitation. Horror washed over me as I realized our mistake. The arranged skeleton wasn't a binding ritual. It was a summoning circle. The ancient people hadn't trapped these creatures here. They'd called them. "Jake, run!" I shouted, but it was too late. The creatures flowed toward us from all directions, moving with inhuman speed. Jake tried to reach the RV, but gray hands reached out from the shadows and dragged him to the ground. I heard him scream once, then nothing. I scrambled toward the protective chamber, but the creatures were faster. Cold fingers wrapped around my ankles, pulling me back into the plaza. I fell hard on the ancient stones, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue. The leader loomed over me, its face shifting and changing like smoke. "The old compact is fulfilled," it said. "New vessels have come to replace the worn ones. The hunger continues." "What compact?" I gasped. "The agreement made long ago. The people of this place offered themselves willingly, became our hosts, our disguises. In exchange, we protected their territory from other predators, other hungers that stalked the night. Around me, the other creatures were changing. Their gray skin rippled and flowed, taking on new forms. I watched in horror as one of them shifted into a perfect replica of Jake, complete with his clothing and equipment. Another became a mirror image of myself. "Your memories are rich," the leader said, its voice now sounding exactly like mine. "Your knowledge will serve us well as we spread beyond this place. The outside world has grown large and complex since our last awakening. We will need time to learn its ways." "The refuge," I whispered. "The cranes." How long have you been there? Decades. The water and food attract many creatures. We studied them, learned from them, prepared for this moment. Your kind builds refuges and parks, gathering animals in convenient locations for us to observe and imitate. The creature that looked like Jake knelt beside me, wearing my brother's face but with those ancient, hungry eyes. Your brother fought well, it said in Jake's voice. His memories of bird behavior are particularly useful. We understand now why your kind finds our previous disguises insufficient. What happened to the real Jake? He feeds us now, the thing said. His life force sustains us as we complete our transformation. Soon, he will be just memory, just knowledge we can access when needed. I tried to struggle, but more hands held me down. The leader placed one impossibly long finger against my forehead, and I felt something cold and alien probing the edges of my consciousness. Your memories of the outside world, it said. Cities, roads, technologies we have not seen. Show us. Images flashed through my mind. Not my own thoughts, but the creature rifling through my memories like files in a cabinet. I saw my life in Denver, my work at the accounting firm, my knowledge of highways and airports and communication networks. The creature absorbed it all with frightening efficiency. Excellent, it said. Your kind has spread across the continent, connected by vast networks of transportation and information. We will use these pathways to disperse, to establish colonies in every suitable habitat. People will notice, I said weakly. Scientists, wildlife biologists, they'll figure out what you are. Will they? The creature wearing Jake's face smiled. Your brother was a respected researcher. His reports will carry significant weight with your academic institutions. And you are a businessman with connections throughout your region. Together, we can open many doors. The probing in my mind intensified, and I felt my sense of self beginning to fragment. Memories that belonged to me were being copied, cataloged, prepared for use by alien intelligence. Soon, there would be nothing left of David Chen except knowledge useful to these creatures. But in the deepest part of my consciousness, I found something they couldn't touch. My love for Jake, my grief for our father, my guilt over every camping trip we'd postponed because of work. These emotions were too human, too personal for the creatures to fully understand or replicate. And in that small, protected space, I remembered something else. The old man in San Antonio had mentioned fire. The hungry ones fear only flame, he'd said. Fire is life consuming itself. Energy transformed beyond their ability to absorb. My lighter was still in my pocket, a cheap plastic bic I'd brought for the campfire. The creatures hadn't thought to search me. Why would they fear such a simple human tool? With the last of my strength, I managed to slip the lighter from my pocket and flick it to life. The small flame seemed pathetically inadequate against the horde of creatures surrounding me, but their reaction was immediate and violent. They recoiled as if the tiny flame were a blazing torch, their forms wavering and becoming indistinct. The leader released its hold on my mind, stumbling backward with something like fear in its ancient eyes. "Impossible," it hissed. "The flame should not harm us here. This place belongs to us." I held the lighter high, its small circle of light pushing back the shadows. "This place belongs to the dead," I said, understanding finally flooding through me. "The people who lived here, the ones who made the compact with you, they're still here, still protecting this place. Around the plaza, I could see them now. Translucent figures standing among the ruins, the ghosts of the ancient Pueblo dwellers. They had been waiting, watching, maintaining their vigil across the centuries. The protective symbols weren't just carvings. They were powered by the spirits of those who had died defending their home. The creature, wearing Jake's face, snarled and lunged toward me, but one of the ghostly figures stepped into its path. Ancient hands grasped the false Jake, and where they touched, the creature's stolen form began to dissolve. "The compact is broken," said a voice that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "You have taken by force what was offered freely. The protection is withdrawn." All around the plaza, the spirits were engaging the creatures in battle. It was a strange, silent conflict. Shadows wrestling with shadows, memory fighting against hunger. But gradually, the spirits were winning. The creatures' stolen forms wavered and collapsed, revealing their true shapes beneath. I used the distraction to search for Jake, following the sound of labored breathing to a collapsed wall near the edge of the ruins. I found him there, unconscious but alive, his life force partially drained but not entirely consumed. "Jake!" I shook his shoulder and his eyes fluttered open. "David?" His voice was weak, confused. "What happened? Where are we?" "Later," I said, helping him to his feet. "We need to get out of here while the spirits keep them busy." We stumbled through the ruins toward the parking area, the battle between ancient forces raging behind us. The Winnebago's engine turned over on the first try, and I drove away from that place as fast as the desert road would allow. In the rearview mirror, I could see flames rising from the Pueblo ruins. Not destructive fire, but a cleansing light that seemed to come from the stones themselves. The spirits were reclaiming their territory, driving out the hungry ones who had violated the ancient compact. We drove through the night, putting as many miles as possible between ourselves and the refuge. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to recover from whatever the creatures had done to him. When he was lucid, he asked questions I couldn't answer, tried to make sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. "The photos," he said suddenly as we passed through Albuquerque. "Did you save the photos?" I looked at his camera bag sitting on the floor where he'd dropped it during our flight from the wetlands. "They're probably still there." "Why?" "Evidence," he said weakly. "Proof of what we saw." But when we checked the camera later, every photo from the refuge was corrupted. Digital files that showed nothing but static and distortion. Whatever those creatures were, they had the ability to affect electronic devices, to erase evidence of their existence. We never reported what happened at Bosque del Apache. Who would have believed us? Instead, we went home to Colorado and tried to rebuild our lives. Jake took a leave of absence from the university, claiming exhaustion and stress. I sold my accounting practice and moved to a small mountain town where I could work remotely and avoid crowds. The nightmares lasted for months. Dreams of gray shapes wearing familiar faces, of ancient hungers stirring in forgotten places, of flocks of false birds spreading across the continent. But gradually, the dreams faded and life returned to something approaching normal. Jake eventually returned to his research, but he specialized in different areas now: conservation genetics, habitat preservation, the protection of endangered species. He never studied migration patterns again, never worked with large bird populations. When colleagues asked about his change in focus, he cited personal reasons and changed the subject. We stay in touch, talking every few weeks, visiting each other for holidays. But we never speak about those days at the refuge. The experience created a bond between us that doesn't need words. A shared understanding of how fragile the boundary is between the world we know and the hungry darkness that waits beyond it. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working on my computer, I'll get news alerts about unusual wildlife behavior in national parks and refugees. Flocks that move with unnatural coordination, animals that don't react normally to human presence, migration patterns that break decades of established data. Each time, I wonder if they're spreading again, finding new hosts in new locations. The ancient compact at Bosque del Apache may have been broken, but there are other places, other forgotten agreements between humans and things that should not be. The Southwest is full of ruins, full of sites where ancient peoples made bargains with forces they couldn't fully understand. Jake thinks I'm paranoid, that the trauma of our experience has made me see threats where none exist. Maybe he's right. Maybe the unusual animal behavior is just climate change, habitat disruption, the normal chaos of ecological systems under stress. But I remember those human faces grafted onto alien forms, remember the patient hunger in those ancient eyes. And I know that somewhere out there, in remote refuges and forgotten wilderness areas, the hungry ones are waiting. They're learning from us, adapting to our modern world, preparing for their next emergence. The protective spirits can only guard so many places, maintain so many ancient boundaries. Eventually, the creatures will find a location where the barriers are weak, where no ghostly guardians stand watch. When that happens, they won't make the same mistakes they made at Bosque del Apache. They'll be more careful, more subtle. They'll spread slowly, taking hosts one at a time, building their knowledge of human society until they're ready to reveal themselves. I try not to think about it too much. I focus on my work, on the peaceful rhythm of small-town life, on the simple pleasure of watching genuine birds at my backyard feeders. Real hawks and ravens and finches, behaving exactly as birds should behave. But sometimes, when I see a flock of sandhill cranes passing overhead during their spring and fall migrations, I count them carefully. I watch their flight patterns, listen to their calls, study their behavior for any sign that something else might be wearing their forms. So far, they've all been real, natural, beautifully, perfectly, normally avian. But I keep watching, because somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of the American Southwest, ancient hungers are stirring. And next time, they'll be ready for us. The compact may be broken, but the hunger never dies. It only sleeps, waiting for its next chance to feed on the warmth of living things. And when it wakes again, I doubt we'll be as lucky as we were in that abandoned pueblo, protected by the ghosts of people who understood what they were fighting. Next time, we'll be on our own. Jake still has that camera, the one that captured and lost the only evidence of what we encountered. Sometimes I catch him staring at it, as if hoping the corrupted files might somehow restore themselves, might prove that our shared nightmare was real. But the files remain empty, digital tombstones for memories that only we carry. And perhaps that's for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, some truths too terrible to document. We survived our encounter with the hungry ones, but we didn't escape unchanged. We carry their memory with us always, a constant reminder that the natural world holds horrors beyond human imagination, and we know that our survival was largely due to luck. Being in the right place when ancient protections activated, having the simple wisdom to respect forces we couldn't understand. Next time, others might not be so fortunate. Next time, the hungry ones might succeed in their patient plan to spread beyond their ancient boundaries and establish themselves in our modern world. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the spirits maintain their vigil. Hope the creatures remain bound to their forgotten places. Hope that the natural balance between light and darkness holds for another 1,000 years. But I keep that lighter on my desk, fully charged and ready, just in case. Because fire is life consuming itself, energy transformed beyond any alien hunger's ability to absorb. And sometimes that small flame is all that stands between us and the ancient darkness that waits in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between breaths, in the hollow places where hungry things learn to wear the faces of everything we love. We should have never gone to Chaco Culture National Historical Park. I'm Marcus Thompson. I was 28 back then, and this is the story of how I lost everything. The plan had been simple enough. My girlfriend Elena and I had been dating for 2 years, and we'd been talking about taking our relationship to the next level. I'd bought a ring 3 months earlier and had been carrying it around, waiting for the perfect moment. Elena loved archaeology and ancient cultures, so when I suggested we spend a long weekend exploring Chaco Canyon in her RV, she jumped at the idea. "It'll be perfect," she'd said, her dark eyes lighting up with excitement. "Just us, the stars, and all that history. We can hike to the great houses, see the petroglyphs, maybe catch a ranger program about the ancestral Puebloans." Elena was a third-grade teacher in Albuquerque, but her real passion was pre-Columbian cultures. Our apartment was filled with books about Mesa Verde, Bandelier, Canyon de Chelly. She'd done her master's thesis on Chacan road systems and had been wanting to visit the park for years. Her RV was a 2019 Airstream Interstate, sleek and modern but compact enough for 2 people. We'd taken it on several trips around New Mexico and Colorado, and it had become our mobile sanctuary. Elena had decorated the interior with Navajo textiles and pottery she'd collected. creating a warm, intimate space that felt more like home than my sterile apartment ever had. The drive from Albuquerque took about 3 hours, the last 20 miles on rough dirt roads that tested the Airstream's suspension. As we bounced and rattled toward the park, Elena read aloud from her guidebooks, filling me in on Chaco astronomy and architecture. I half listened, more focused on the engagement ring in my backpack and the speech I'd been rehearsing for weeks. The Chacons were incredible astronomers, she was saying as we navigated a particularly rough section of road. They aligned their buildings with solar and lunar cycles, tracked the movements of celestial bodies with precision that rivals modern instruments. And the acoustics in the Great Kivas are supposed to be amazing. You can whisper on one side and be heard clearly on the other. I said, gripping the steering wheel as we hit another pothole. Sounds fascinating. She looked over at me with that patient smile she used on her students when they weren't paying attention. You're nervous about something. What's going on? Just concentrating on the road, I lied. Don't want to damage your baby here. The Airstream was Elena's pride and joy. She'd saved for 3 years to buy it, working summer jobs and tutoring on weekends. It represented freedom to her, the ability to explore the Southwest's archaeological treasures without being tied to hotel reservations or campground schedules. When we finally reached Chaco Canyon, the landscape took my breath away. Red sandstone cliffs rose on either sides of a broad wash, their faces carved and sculpted by millennia of wind and water. Ancient roads, invisible from ground level but clearly visible from the air, converged on the canyon like spokes on a wheel. And scattered throughout the valley floor were the ruins of the great houses, massive stone structures that had once housed thousands of people in a civilization that thrived 1,000 years ago. We checked in with the rangers and found a campsite in the Gallo campground, a small loop with 30-odd spaces nestled among sagebrush and 4 o'clock flowers. The sites were well spaced, and in mid-October we had the place mostly to ourselves. Only 3 other RVs were visible, all at the far end of the loop. It's perfect, Elena said as we leveled the Airstream and hooked up the utilities. Look at those cliffs, and tonight's supposed to be clear. The stargazing here is supposed to be incredible. That first afternoon, we hiked the Pueblo Bonito Trail, exploring the ruins of what had once been the largest building in North America. Elena was in her element, explaining the significance of the architecture, the sophistication of the engineering, the mysteries that still surrounded Chacan culture. They built all this without metal tools, she said, running her hand along a perfectly fitted stone wall. No beasts of burden, no wheeled vehicles, just human ingenuity and incredible organization. At its peak, this place was the center of a trade network that stretched from Mexico to the Colorado Plateau. I nodded and took pictures, but I was more focused on finding the right moment for my proposal. I'd planned to do it at sunset from the top of the mesa, with the ruins spread out below us and the vast New Mexico sky stretching to the horizon. But as evening approached, clouds began building to the west, and by the time we made it back to the RV, the sky was overcast and threatening rain. Tomorrow, I told myself, tomorrow will be perfect. We made dinner on the Airstream's small stove, pasta with pesto and grilled vegetables, and opened a bottle of wine Elena had been saving for a special occasion. As darkness fell, we sat outside in our folding chairs, listening to the sounds of the desert night and watching for breaks in the clouds that might reveal the famous Chaco night sky. That's when we first heard the drumming. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind in the sagebrush, a rhythmic beating that seemed to come from the direction of the ruins. Elena looked up from her wine glass, head tilted to listen. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened carefully. There it was, a steady, pulsing rhythm like a heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. "Probably just other campers," I said. "Maybe someone brought a drum." But even as I said it, I didn't quite believe it. The sound was too deep, too resonant, and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. Elena stood up and walked to the edge of our campsite, looking toward the ruins. "It's coming from Pueblo Bonito," she said, "but that's impossible. The park closes at sunset, and there's no camping allowed near the ruins." The drumming continued for about 20 minutes, then faded away as gradually as it had begun. We sat in silence for a while afterward, both of us straining to hear any other sounds, but the night had returned to its normal symphony of wind and distant coyotes. Acoustics, Elena said finally. Chaco has some weird acoustic properties. Sound can carry for miles in these canyons, bounce off the cliff faces in strange ways. It was probably someone drumming miles away, and the sound just channeled down the wash. That explanation satisfied us both, and we finished our wine and went to bed around 10 o'clock. The Airstream's queen-size bed was comfortable, and after the long drive and afternoon hike, I fell asleep quickly. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of Elena whispering. She was sitting up in bed beside me, her silhouette barely visible in the darkness of the RV. Her voice was so quiet I could barely make out the words, but she seemed to be having a conversation with someone. "Elena," I whispered. "Who are you talking to?" She turned toward me, and in the faint starlight filtering through the window, I could see her face. Her eyes were open but unfocused, as if she were looking at something I couldn't see. "The builders," she said in that same quiet voice. "They're showing me the plans, the alignment with the Pleiades, the mathematics of the spiral." I reached over and gently shook her shoulder. "Elena, you're dreaming. Wake up." She blinked several times, then looked around the RV with confusion. "What?" I was dreaming about Pueblo Bonito. The most vivid dream. I could see it as it was when it was inhabited. Hundreds of people, fires burning in the courtyards, ceremonies in the great kiva, and there was someone there, an elder, showing me how they calculated the solar alignments. "Just a dream," I said, though something about the intensity in her voice made me uneasy. "You've been reading about this stuff all day. Your subconscious is just processing it." She lay back down, but I could tell she wasn't ready to go back to sleep. It felt so real, Marcus. Like I was actually there, actually experiencing it. I could smell the smoke from the fires, feel the sandstone under my feet, and the elder, he knew I was there. He was teaching me, showing me things that aren't in any of the books. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her close. "Must have been some dream. Maybe you should be an archaeologist instead of a teacher." "Maybe," she said, but her voice was distant, distracted. He said something strange at the end. He said the old ways were returning, that the stars were coming back into alignment. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't say why. "Just a dream," I repeated, as much to convince myself as her. Eventually, we both drifted back to sleep, but I woke several more times during the night to find Elena sitting up, staring out the window toward the ruins. Each time, she claimed she couldn't sleep, that she felt drawn to look outside. When morning finally came, we were both exhausted. The second day started better. Elena seemed more like herself over breakfast, laughing at my attempts to make pancakes on the RV's tiny stove and planning our hiking agenda for the day. We decided to explore Casa Rinconada, a great kiva about a mile from the main ruins complex. The hike was beautiful, winding through piñon and juniper forests with spectacular views of the canyon. Casa Rinconada itself was impressive. A circular ceremonial chamber 60 feet in diameter with complex acoustic properties and precise astronomical alignments. Elena was fascinated by the engineering, the way the ancient builders had oriented the structure to capture the light of the summer solstice. "Stand over there," she called, positioning me on one side of the kiva while she walked to the opposite edge. "Now, say something." What should I say? Anything. Just talk normally. "This is weird," I said in my normal speaking voice. From 60 feet away, Elena laughed. "I can hear you perfectly. It's like you're standing right next to me. The acoustics are incredible." We spent an hour experimenting with the sound properties, whispering across the circular chamber, listening to how our voices carried and amplified. It was fascinating, but also slightly unnerving. There was something about the place that felt charged, expectant, as if it were waiting for something. As we prepared to leave, Elena lingered at the edge of the kiva, staring down into the circular chamber. "Can you feel it?" she asked. "Feel what?" "The presence, the energy. It's like the place is still alive, still being used. I looked around at the ancient stonework, the precisely placed doorways and windows, the niches that had once held ceremonial objects. It was impressive, certainly, but it felt like a ruin to me. Old stones and empty spaces. Beautiful, but long dead. I don't feel anything, I said. Maybe you're just more sensitive to this stuff than I am. She nodded absently, but didn't move. He's here, she said suddenly. Who's here? The elder from my dream. He's standing right there, in the center of the kiva. He's waiting for something. I looked where she was pointing and saw nothing but empty space and ancient stonework. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Elena, there's no one there. You can't see him. She sounded genuinely surprised. He's wearing traditional clothing, turquoise jewelry. He's holding something. Looks like a piece of pottery with spirals painted on it. I walked over and took her hand. It was ice cold despite the warm afternoon sun. Elena, you're scaring me. There's no one in the kiva. She blinked several times, then looked around with confusion. He was just there. I could see him as clearly as I can see you. Hallucination, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You're probably dehydrated. Let's get back to the RV and get some water in you. But even as we walked back along the trail, Elena kept looking over her shoulder toward Casa Rinconada. And twice I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind us, though when I turned around, the trail was empty. That afternoon, Elena took a nap while I read outside in my chair. She'd been tossing and turning since we got back, muttering in her sleep about spirals and star patterns and something called the return. I was starting to worry about her. The Elena I knew was practical, grounded, skeptical of anything that couldn't be proven or documented. This talk of visions and presences wasn't like her at all. Around 4 o'clock, I heard her cry out from inside the RV. I rushed in to find her sitting up in bed, her face pale and her hands shaking. The pottery, she said. I know what it means now. The spirals aren't decorative, they're a map of the convergence points. What convergence points? I asked, sitting down beside her. The places where the old roads meet, where the energy lines cross. He showed me in the dream. There are 7 points around the canyon where the ancient builders placed markers, pottery shards with the spiral pattern, and something's supposed to happen when all 7 are activated. I took her hands in mine. They were still trembling. Elena, you're having dreams. Very vivid dreams, but dreams nonetheless. The stress of work, the altitude, maybe something you ate. There are lots of explanations. But what if they're not dreams? She said, her eyes wide and intense. What if the builders left something behind? Some kind of message or warning? What if I'm supposed to find the convergence points? Before I could answer, we heard the drumming again. This time it was much louder, much closer. The rhythmic beating seemed to be coming from directly outside the RV, so loud that the windows vibrated with each pulse. I jumped up and looked out but saw nothing except sagebrush and empty campsites. It's them, Elena whispered. They're calling to me. The drumming continued for several minutes, joined by what sounded like chanting. Multiple voices singing in a language I didn't recognize. Elena stood up and moved toward the RV's door. Don't, I said, grabbing her arm. Don't go out there. I have to, she said, and her voice sounded different. Older somehow, more formal. They've been waiting so long. The alignment is almost complete. I held onto her arm as she reached for the door handle. Elena, stop. This isn't you talking. She turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize the person looking back. Her eyes were different, darker, deeper, as if I were looking into vast spaces instead of familiar brown eyes. The spiral calls to those who understand, she said in that strange, formal voice. The old ways must be preserved. The convergence must be completed. Then she blinked, and she was Elena again, looking confused and frightened. Marcus, what's happening to me? The drumming stopped abruptly, leaving us in sudden, oppressive silence. Elena collapsed into my arms, trembling, and I held her tight while my mind raced. Something was wrong here. Something beyond stress or altitude sickness or vivid dreams. The Elena I knew didn't speak in archaic phrases or talk about convergences and alignments. "We should leave," I said. "Pack up the RV and drive back to Albuquerque tonight." "No." Her voice was firm, decisive. "Not yet. I need to understand what's happening. I need to find the convergence points." "Elena." "I'm an archaeologist, Marcus. Well, almost an archaeologist. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. What if there really is something the Chacons left behind? Some knowledge that's been waiting for the right person to find it." I wanted to argue, wanted to drag her to the driver's seat and force her to leave this place. But I could see the determination in her eyes, the scholarly excitement that had always been one of the things I loved most about her. And part of me, the rational, skeptical part, still believed there had to be a logical explanation for everything that was happening. "One more night," I said finally. "But if this gets any weirder, we're leaving in the morning." She nodded and kissed me. And for a moment, she felt like the Elena I knew again. "One more night, I promise." That evening, we drove to the visitor center for a ranger program about Chaco astronomy. The ranger, a middle-aged Navajo woman named Dr. Begay, gave a fascinating presentation about how the ancient builders had incorporated celestial observations into their architecture. The Chacoans were sophisticated astronomers, she explained, showing slides of architectural features aligned with various celestial events. They tracked not just the sun and moon, but Venus, the Pleiades, even the 18-year lunar cycle. Their buildings are essentially stone calendars, designed to mark important dates in their ceremonial calendar. Elena sat transfixed, taking notes furiously. During the question period, she raised her hand. "Dr. Begay, have there been any discoveries of astronomical markers outside the main building complexes? Pottery or carved stones that might indicate observation points or ceremonial sites?" The ranger looked thoughtful. "There have been some finds over the years. Pottery shards with astronomical markings mostly. But many of the outlying sites haven't been fully excavated. There could be much more out there that we haven't discovered yet." After the program, Elena approached Dr. Begay and they talked for several minutes about Chacan road systems and outlying sites. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught phrases like convergence theory and energy lines that made me uneasy. When Elena finally rejoined me, she was practically vibrating with excitement. "She confirmed it," Elena said as we walked back to the parking lot. "There are unexplored sites throughout the canyon, places where the old roads converge. She even mentioned finding pottery with spiral markings at some of them." "That doesn't mean anything supernatural is happening," I pointed out. "It just means the Chacons were more widespread than previously thought. But what if it's more than that? What if they created a system, a network of sites designed to work together for some purpose we don't understand yet?" I could see I wasn't going to talk her out of this. The academic in her had taken hold, and when Elena got interested in a research question, she was like a dog with a bone. "Okay," I said. "So what do you want to do?" "Tomorrow morning, I want to hike out to some of the convergence points, see if I can find any of the pottery markers." Dr. Begay gave me GPS coordinates for several sites that haven't been fully documented. I sighed. "And if we don't find anything, then we pack up and go home." And I write this off as an overactive imagination combined with too much reading about Chacoan mysteries. It seemed like a reasonable compromise, and I was still holding out hope that a good night's sleep would restore Elena's normal skeptical outlook. We drove back to the campground and settled in for the evening. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, Elena started talking in her sleep again, carrying on long conversations in a language that definitely wasn't English or Spanish. When I tried to wake her, she looked at me with those strange, deep eyes and said, "The spiral is almost complete. Only 3 more points to activate." Then she fell back into normal sleep, leaving me wide awake and deeply disturbed. I must have dozed off eventually, because I was awakened by the sound of the RV's door opening. I looked over, and Elena's side of the bed was empty. Pale, pre-dawn light was filtering through the windows. I threw on clothes and rushed outside, calling her name. She was nowhere to be seen among the campsites, but I could see footprints in the sandy soil leading toward the ruins. I grabbed a flashlight and followed them. The footprints led along the main trail toward Pueblo Bonito, then branched off onto a smaller path I hadn't noticed before. The trail wound through thick stands of sagebrush and 4 o'clock flowers, climbing gradually toward the base of the north cliff. I found Elena standing in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the main ruins. She was dressed in the clothes she'd worn the day before, but her feet were bare and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. She stood perfectly motionless in the center of the clearing, her arms raised toward the lightening sky. "Elena," I called out, "what are you doing?" She didn't respond. As I got closer, I could see that the clearing wasn't natural. Ancient stone walls, mostly buried under centuries of sand and debris, formed a rough circle around the space, and scattered throughout the circle were pottery shards, dozens of them, all decorated with the spiral pattern Elena had been dreaming about. She was standing in the exact center of the circle, and as I watched, she began to turn slowly, her arms still raised, her lips moving in what looked like a chant or prayer. With each rotation, the pottery shards seemed to catch and reflect the growing dawn light. "Elena, you're sleepwalking," I said, approaching carefully. "Come back to the RV with me." She completed 3 full rotations, then stopped and lowered her arms. When she turned to face me, her eyes were completely black. Not just the irises, but the whites as well, as if they were filled with dark water. "The first convergence is complete," she said in that formal, archaic voice. 6 more to go. Then she collapsed. I caught her before she hit the ground and carried her back to the RV. She was unconscious but breathing normally, and by the time I got her back to bed, her eyes had returned to their normal brown color. She slept for 3 more hours while I sat beside her, watching for any sign of the strange behavior. When she finally woke up, she claimed to remember nothing about the early morning excursion. She had no recollection of leaving the RV, no memory of the circular clearing or the pottery shards. As far as she knew, she'd slept through the night. "But I had the most amazing dream," she said over breakfast. "I was standing in some kind of ceremonial circle, performing a ritual I somehow knew how to do. And when I finished, I could feel something activate, like a power source coming online." I described what I'd actually witnessed, and her face grew pale. "You're saying I was sleepwalking? That I actually found one of the convergence points?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, and it's exactly why we need to leave. Now. Today." But Elena was already pulling out her GPS unit and the notes she'd taken from Dr. Begay. "Marcus, don't you understand what this means? I found one of the sites. There really is a network of ceremonial locations. This could revolutionize our understanding of Chacoan culture. What it means is that you're having some kind of psychological episode," I said firmly. "Sleepwalking, hallucinations, personality changes. These are symptoms of serious mental health issues. We need to get you to a doctor." "I'm not crazy," she said, and for a moment that strange formality crept back into her voice. "I'm being called, chosen. The builders left a message for someone who could understand it, someone who could complete their work. The builders are dead, Elena. They've been dead for 1,000 years." She looked at me with pity in her eyes. "Death isn't the end, Marcus. The old ones knew that. Energy doesn't die, it just changes form. They're still here, still working, still waiting for the convergence to be completed." I felt like I was talking to a stranger wearing Elena's face. The woman I loved was practical, grounded in empirical evidence. She didn't believe in spirits or energy or ancient mystical knowledge. But the person sitting across from me in the RV's dinette was someone else entirely. "We're leaving," I said. "I'm driving us back to Albuquerque and we're going to see a doctor." "No." Her voice was calm but absolute. "I have work to finish here. If you want to leave, you can take your truck back to the city. But I'm staying until the convergence is complete." I stared at her in shock. In 2 years of dating, Elena had never been unreasonable about anything. We'd always been able to talk through our disagreements, find compromises that worked for both of us. But the person looking back at me now seemed incapable of compromise. "I'm not leaving you here alone," I said. "Then stay and help me. There are 6 more convergence points to activate. With your help, We could complete the work in 2 or 3 days. Elena, listen to yourself. You're talking about activating ancient ceremonial sites, about completing work that was supposedly left unfinished 1,000 years ago. Does that sound rational to you? She smiled, and for a moment she looked like my Elena again. I know how it sounds, but sometimes the most important discoveries require a leap of faith. Columbus thought he could reach the Indies by sailing west. Darwin proposed that humans evolved from apes. Copernicus suggested that the Earth revolved around the sun. All of them sounded crazy to their contemporaries. It was a compelling argument, delivered in Elena's normal voice with her usual intelligence and passion. For a moment, I almost believed her. But then, I remembered her standing in that circle with those black, inhuman eyes, and I knew that whatever was happening to her went far beyond scientific discovery. "One more day," I said finally. "We'll explore one more convergence point together. But if you have another episode like this morning, we're leaving immediately." She nodded eagerly. "Just one more. And I promise, if nothing happens, if there's no evidence of genuine archaeological significance, I'll pack up and come home with you." We spent the morning planning the expedition to the second convergence point, located about 3 miles east of the main ruins complex. According to Elena's notes, it was situated at the intersection of 2 ancient roads, marked by what Dr. Begay had described as unusual pottery concentrations. The hike took us through spectacular country, red sandstone mesas, deep arroyos carved by flash floods, forests of pinon and juniper that filled the air with their resinous scent. Under normal circumstances, I would have enjoyed every minute of it. But I couldn't shake the image of Elena's black eyes, or the feeling that we were walking into something dangerous. We found the second site around noon. Like the first, it was a circular clearing surrounded by ancient stone walls. But this one was larger and more elaborate, with distinct chambers radiating out from the central circle like spokes on a wheel. And the pottery shards here were different. Larger pieces, some still bearing traces of the original painted designs. Elena walked to the center of the circle and stood motionless for several minutes, her eyes closed and her face turned toward the sky. I watched nervously, ready to intervene if she showed any signs of the morning's strange behavior. "I can feel it," she said suddenly. "The potential, like a tuning fork that's been struck but isn't quite resonating yet." "Elena, it's okay," she said, opening her eyes. They were still their normal brown color. "I'm still me, but I can sense what this place was designed to do. It's like a receiver, a way of channeling and focusing some kind of energy." I looked around at the ancient stonework, trying to see what she was seeing. It was impressive engineering, certainly, but it looked like ruins to me. Dead stones in empty desert. "What kind of energy?" I asked. "I'm not sure. Astronomical energy, maybe? The alignments here are incredibly precise. This chamber points directly toward the summer solstice sunrise, that one toward the winter solstice sunset. And the central circle is aligned with the Pleiades." She was using her normal voice, employing archaeological terminology I'd heard her use dozens of times before. For the moment, at least, she seemed like herself. "So, what now?" I asked. "Now, we document everything. Take measurements, photograph the pottery, make detailed notes about the alignments. This is exactly the kind of discovery that could make a career." We spent the next few hours working systematically through the site. Elena was in full archaeologist mode, measuring angles and sketching layouts while I took photographs and made notes. It felt almost normal, like one of our usual expeditions to Mesa Verde or Canyon de Chelly. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice subtle changes in Elena's behavior. She started spending longer periods standing motionless in the center of the circle, her eyes closed and her lips moving silently. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was listening to the harmonics of the site. Around 4 o'clock, she suddenly grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" I listened carefully. The desert was quiet except for the wind in the sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk. "I don't hear anything. The humming, it's coming from the stones themselves." I pressed my ear against one of the ancient walls. Nothing but silence. "Elena, there's no humming. You don't have the sensitivity," she said matter-of-factly. "Not everyone can hear it, but it's getting stronger. The site is responding to my presence." A chill ran down my spine. She was talking about the ruins as if they were alive, as if they were reacting to her somehow. "Maybe we should head back to the RV." "Not yet. The sun's going to set soon, and I think that's when the real activation happens, when the shadows align properly with the chambers." I looked at the lengthening shadows cast by the stone walls, and for a moment I could almost see what she meant. The shadows did seem to form patterns, creating lines and intersections that weren't visible in full daylight. "Elena, I don't like this. Something's not right here." She wasn't listening. She'd walked back to the center of the circle and was standing with her arms raised just as she had that morning. As the sun sank lower, the shadows of the radiating chambers began to converge on the spot where she stood. "Elena, come on, let's go." "Almost there," she whispered. "Almost complete." The shadows continued to converge until they formed a perfect spiral pattern around Elena's feet. At the exact moment when the pattern completed itself, she began to glow. It was subtle at first, just a faint luminescence around her skin, like bioluminescent plankton. But as I watched in horror, the glow grew brighter, until Elena was surrounded by a soft, blue-white light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Elena!" I rushed toward her, but as soon as I stepped into the shadow spiral, I was thrown backward by some invisible force. I landed hard against one of the ancient walls, the breath knocked out of me. Elena began to turn slowly, her arms still raised, her eyes now completely black again. With each rotation, the light around her grew brighter, and I could hear that humming she'd mentioned. A deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "The second convergence is complete," she said in that formal, archaic voice. "5 more to go." Then the light faded, and she collapsed again. I carried her back to the RV in darkness, stumbling along the trail with only my flashlight to guide the way. She remained unconscious until we reached the campground, then woke up confused and disoriented. "What happened?" she asked as I helped her into the RV. I remember being at the site, taking measurements, but everything after that is a blank. I told her what I'd witnessed, and she stared at me in shock. I was glowing. "That's impossible." "I saw it with my own eyes, Elena. You were standing in a spiral of shadows, glowing like a light bulb, and your eyes were completely black." She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands as if expecting to see traces of the light I'd described. "Maybe," she said finally. "Maybe I'm not going crazy. Maybe something really is happening here. Something is definitely happening." I agreed, "but not something archaeological. Something supernatural. Something dangerous." "The old stories," she said suddenly. "The Navajo stories about Chaco. They say the Chacans didn't just disappear. They were transformed, taken by something ancient that lived in the canyon. Elena, what if the convergence points aren't just ceremonial sites? What if there's some kind of transformation device designed to change people? To turn them into something else?" The fear in her voice was evident, and for a moment she sounded like my Elena again. Rational, skeptical, frightened by the implications of what was happening to her. "Then we leave," I said. "Right now. We pack up and drive back to civilization and never come back here." "But what if it's too late?" she whispered. "What if the process has already started? What if leaving won't stop it?" I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew was that the woman I loved was changing into something else, and I was powerless to stop it. That night, neither of us slept. Elena spent hours standing at the RV's windows, staring out toward the ruins. Twice I caught her reaching for the door handle, and each time I had to physically restrain her from going outside. "They're calling me," she said during one of these episodes. "The builders. They need me to complete the work." "The builders are dead," I said for what felt like the 100th time. "Death is just another state of being," she replied in that formal voice. "They've been waiting so long for someone who could hear them, someone who could finish what they started." Around 3 a.m, I dozed off in my chair by the door. When I woke up an hour later, Elena was gone. I found her at the third convergence point, a site we hadn't even visited yet, somehow located 5 miles north of the campground. She was standing in the center of another circular chamber, glowing brighter than ever, her black eyes fixed on the star-filled sky above. "Elena!" I shouted, but she didn't respond. She was completely entranced, lost in whatever ritual or ceremony she was performing. This time, I didn't try to approach the circle. I'd learned my lesson about the invisible barrier that protected her during these episodes. Instead, I sat on a nearby boulder and waited for the process to complete. But, as I watched, something new happened. Other figures began to appear around the edges of the clearing, translucent shapes that flickered in and out of visibility like heat mirages. They were human in form, but wrong in proportion, tall and elongated with limbs that bent at impossible angles. And their faces were blank, featureless except for dark holes where eyes should have been. The spirit figures moved in perfect synchronization with Elena's rotations, their ghostly forms orbiting the circle in a macabre dance. As they moved, I could hear them whispering in that same unknown language Elena had been speaking in her sleep. "The third convergence is complete," Elena announced, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing despite the distance. 4 more to go. The spirit figures flickered once more and vanished. Elena collapsed, and the clearing returned to normal desert silence. I carried her back to the RV again, but this time she didn't wake up during the journey. She remained unconscious until well past sunrise, and when she finally opened her eyes, something fundamental had changed. "Marcus," she said, sitting up in bed. Her voice was still Elena's, but there was something else layered underneath it. Something ancient and patient. "We need to talk. Elena, are you still you?" She smiled, and the expression was both familiar and utterly alien. "I'm still Elena, but I'm also more than Elena now. I can see things you can't see, understand things you can't understand. The Builders have been sharing their knowledge with me." "The Builders are dead," I said automatically. "Are they?" She stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the ruins. "Death is just a transition, Marcus. Energy changing form. The Builders transcended physical death centuries ago, but they left their consciousness imprinted on this place. They've been waiting for someone with the right sensitivity to complete their work." "What work? What are you supposed to be completing?" She turned back to me, and I could see galaxies spinning in the depths of her eyes. "The Great Convergence. A ceremony that will align this place with certain astronomical phenomena that only occur every few thousand years. When the alignment is complete, the barriers between dimensions will weaken, and the Builders will be able to return to physical form." Horror washed over me as I understood what she was saying. "They're possessing you, using you to perform some kind of summoning ritual." "Not possessing," she corrected gently. "Joining, merging. I retain my consciousness, my memories, my personality, but I also gain access to knowledge that has been hidden for millennia, mathematical principles that could revolutionize our understanding of space and time, astronomical insights that could predict cosmic events centuries in advance." "At what cost?" I demanded. "What happens to you when this convergence is complete?" "I become something greater than human, the first of a new species, enhanced by the wisdom of the Builders. And if you want, Marcus, you could join me. The Builders could share their gifts with you as well." I stared at the woman I loved, trying to see some trace of the Elena I knew in those cosmic eyes. "This isn't you talking. This is them, manipulating you, making you think you want this." "It is me," she insisted. "More me than I've ever been. I can remember every moment of my life with perfect clarity now. I can see the mathematical principles underlying every archaeological site I've ever studied. I understand the true purpose of places like Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, all the great ceremonial centers of the ancient world. Elena, please, fight this. Come back to me." She approached me slowly, reaching out to cup my face in her hands. Her skin was warm, but there was something else there too. A subtle electric tingle, as if she were charged with some alien energy. "I never left, Marcus. I'm still the woman who loves you, who wants to spend her life exploring ancient mysteries with you. But now I have the tools to really understand those mysteries, to unlock secrets that have been hidden for centuries. And all I have to do is let them possess me too? Transform you, she corrected. Enhance you. Give you abilities beyond anything you can imagine. I pulled away from her touch. No, this is where I draw the line. I won't let them turn me into whatever they've turned you into. Pain flashed across her features. Genuine human pain that gave me hope she was still in there somewhere. Then you'll have to watch me complete the convergence alone. Because I can't stop now, Marcus. Even if I wanted to, which I don't, the process has gone too far. The builders need 4 more activation sites to complete their return, and I'm the only one who can activate them. What if I stopped you? What if I physically prevented you from reaching the other sites? You can't, she said simply. You've seen the barrier that protects me during the activations. And besides, the compulsion grows stronger with each site. Soon, I won't be able to resist it even during my conscious moments. I felt utterly helpless. The woman I loved was being systematically erased and replaced by something alien, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Every rational part of my mind screamed that I should leave, should drive back to Albuquerque and get help. But I couldn't abandon Elena, not when there might still be some way to save her. How long do we have? I asked. The next convergence will happen tonight, then 3 more over the following days. By the time the process is complete, the barriers will be thin enough for the builders to begin their return. And then what? They take over the world? Elena laughed, and the sound was like silver bells mixed with wind through ancient stones. They don't want to take over anything, Marcus. They want to transcend, to move beyond the physical limitations that trapped them in this dimension. The convergence will open a doorway for them to pass through to higher planes of existence, taking you with them. If I choose to go, but I could also stay here, in this enhanced form, and help bridge the gap between their knowledge and human understanding. I could revolutionize archaeology, astronomy, mathematics, every field of human knowledge. It was a seductive vision, I had to admit. The idea of Elena as some kind of enhanced human, blessed with the accumulated wisdom of an ancient civilization, was almost appealing. But I couldn't forget those black eyes, or the way she'd glowed with inhuman light, or the alien formality that crept into her voice. I need time to think, I said. You have until tonight, she replied. The 4th convergence site is about 7 miles southeast of here. The activation will begin at sunset, whether you're there or not. I spent the day walking alone through the canyon, trying to process what was happening and figure out what to do. Part of me still hoped this was all some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by altitude and stress. But I'd seen too much, experienced too much to cling to that rational explanation. The Elena I loved was disappearing, being transformed into something that wore her face but thought with an alien mind. And in 3 more days, the process would be complete. I considered trying to physically restrain her, but I'd seen how the invisible barrier protected her during the activations. I thought about calling for help, but we were 40 miles from cell service, and I didn't think park rangers would believe my story about ancient aliens possessing my girlfriend. By late afternoon, I'd reached a decision. I would go with her to the 4th convergence site, not to help with the activation, but to try one last time to reach the Elena I knew. If I could break through the alien influence for even a moment, maybe I could convince her to fight back. I found her at sunset, standing at the edge of our campsite with her day pack already loaded. She looked like my Elena again. Hiking boots, cargo pants, her favorite University of New Mexico t-shirt. But when she turned to smile at me, I could see the cosmic depths swirling behind her eyes. "I'm glad you decided to come," she said. "I was hoping you'd want to witness the 4th convergence." "I want to try to save you," I said honestly. "I don't need saving, Marcus, but I understand your concern. Come on, we need to reach the site before full darkness." The hike to the 4th convergence point took us through country I'd never seen before, following what Elena claimed was one of the ancient Chacoan roads. I couldn't see any trace of a road in the rocky terrain, but Elena moved with confidence as if she were following a clearly marked path. "Can you see the road?" I asked. "I can see everything now," she replied. "The roads, the astronomical alignments, the energy patterns that connect all the sites. It's like having a map of the entire canyon system overlaid on my vision." The fourth site was the most elaborate yet. A complex of interconnected circles and chambers carved directly into a mesa top. Ancient pictographs covered the walls, depicting spirals and star patterns and humanoid figures with elongated limbs. "This is the heart of the network," Elena explained as we climbed toward the central chamber. From here, the builders could monitor all the other sites, coordinate the timing of ceremonies, track celestial movements with incredible precision. I looked around at the ancient stonework, trying to see it through Elena's enhanced perception. It was impressive, certainly, but it still looked like ruins to me. Whatever transformation was happening to her, it hadn't affected my vision. "Elena," I said as we reached the central chamber, "before you do this, I need you to listen to me. Really listen, with the part of you that's still human." She paused at the edge of the circle, turning to look at me with those cosmic eyes. "I'm listening. I love you. The real you, Elena Rodriguez, third-grade teacher from Albuquerque, woman who collects pottery and dreams of making archaeological discoveries. That person is still in there somewhere, and she's worth fighting for." "I know you love me," she said softly. "And I love you too. That hasn't changed, but everything else has. You're not the woman I proposed to come to Chaco Canyon with." Her eyes widened. "You were going to propose?" For a moment, her voice was completely human again, filled with surprise and joy and love. I pulled the engagement ring from my pocket, a simple diamond solitaire that had cost me 3 months' salary. "I had this whole plan," I said. "Sunset on the mesa, with the ruins spread out below us and the stars coming out overhead. I was going to tell you that I wanted to spend my life exploring the world with you, supporting your dreams, making discoveries together." Tears ran down her cheeks. Normal, human tears, not the strange luminescence I'd expected. "Marcus, that woman, the one who would have said yes to this ring, she's still in there. Fight for her, Elena. Don't let them erase who you are." She took the ring with trembling hands, staring at it as if it were an anchor to her humanity. For several minutes, she stood motionless at the edge of the circle, torn between two realities. Then the sun touched the horizon, and the shadows began to shift. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I heard both Elena and the alien intelligence speaking in unison. "It's too late to stop now." She stepped into the center of the circle and began to glow again, brighter than ever before. But this time, she clutched the engagement ring to her chest, and I could see her fighting to maintain some core of human identity, even as the alien transformation continued. The spirit figures appeared again, dozens of them now, filling the entire mesa top with their ghostly presence. They chanted in that unknown language while Elena rotated in the center of the circle, her light growing so bright I had to shield my eyes. "The fourth convergence is complete," she announced, but her voice broke on the words, as if she were struggling to speak them. 3 more to go. When the light faded and the spirits vanished, Elena collapsed again. But this time, when I reached her, she was still conscious. "Marcus," she gasped, still clutching the ring. "Help me. I can feel them taking more of me with each activation. Soon there won't be enough of Elena left to fight back." Hope flared in my chest. The ring had worked, had given her something human to hold on to. "Tell me what to do." "The final 3 sites," she said, struggling to sit up. "They have to be activated in a specific sequence at specific times, when the astronomical alignments are perfect. If even one activation fails, the entire convergence collapses. So we stop the next activation? It's not that simple. The compulsion is too strong now. When the time comes, I won't be able to resist. But maybe you could physically prevent me from reaching the site." "How?" "Tie me up, lock me in the RV. Do whatever it takes to keep me away from the 5th convergence point until the window passes." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only hope we had. We made our way back to the campground in darkness, Elena leaning heavily on my arm as she fought against the alien influence trying to reassert control. Back at the RV, I used climbing rope to secure her to the dinette bench, tying the knots tight enough that she couldn't slip free but not so tight as to cut off circulation. She submitted to the restraints willingly, though I could see the struggle in her eyes. "The next activation is tomorrow night," she said. "The site is about 10 miles north of here, on top of Fajada Butte. The window opens at 9:47 p.m. and closes at 10:15. If I can't reach the site during that time, the sequence will be broken. And then what? You'll be free? I don't know. The builders might try to find another way, or they might retreat and wait for the next opportunity. But I'll have bought us time to figure out a more permanent solution." I spent the night sitting beside her, talking about our memories together, trying to reinforce her human identity. She responded lucidly for the most part, though occasionally the alien intelligence would surface and speak in that formal, archaic voice. As the next day wore on, Elena became increasingly agitated. The compulsion to reach the fifth convergence site grew stronger, and she pulled against her restraints with growing desperation. "Marcus, you have to let me go," she pleaded around 6 o'clock. "They're calling to me. I can hear them so clearly now. They need me to complete the work." "That's not you talking," I reminded her. "That's them. Focus on the ring. Focus on us." She looked down at the engagement ring, which she still wore on her finger, and her eyes cleared momentarily. "I'm trying, but it's getting harder to remember who I am. They're showing me such incredible things, Marcus. The mathematics that govern the universe, the hidden connections between all things. It's hard to want to give that up." By 9 o'clock, she was practically writhing against her restraints, begging me to release her. The alien intelligence had taken almost complete control, speaking through her mouth in that strange language while her eyes had turned black again. At 9:47 p.m. exactly, she let out a scream of anguish that seemed to come from both the human Elena and the alien presence inside her. The sound was so terrible that several other campers came over to check on us, but I sent them away with excuses about food poisoning. The screaming continued for 28 minutes, the exact duration of the activation window. When it finally stopped, Elena slumped forward in her restraints, completely unconscious. I untied her and carried her to bed, then sat beside her for the rest of the night, watching for signs of consciousness. When she finally woke up around dawn, her eyes were brown again, and when she spoke, it was with her own voice. "Did it work?" she asked weakly. "I think so. You missed the activation window. The sequence should be broken." She closed her eyes and was quiet for several minutes. "I can still feel them," she said finally, "but they're distant now, disappointed. They're retreating to wherever they came from. Is it over? For now. But Marcus, I'm changed. I can still see things I shouldn't be able to see. Know things I shouldn't know. I don't think I'll ever be completely normal again." I took her hand, feeling the engagement ring on her finger. "Normal is overrated. The question is, are you still you?" She smiled, a genuinely human expression despite everything she'd been through. "I'm still me. Different, maybe. Enhanced in some ways. But still, Elena Rodriguez. Still the woman who loves you and wants to explore ancient mysteries with you. Enhanced how? I can read the landscape now in ways I never could before, see the hidden connections between archaeological sites, understand the mathematical principles underlying ancient architecture. The builders shared their knowledge with me, even if they couldn't complete their return. It wasn't the Elena I'd brought to Chaco Canyon, but it was close enough. The core personality was still there, still recognizably the woman I loved. And if she'd gained some kind of archaeological superpower in the process, maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. "So, what now?" I asked. "Now we go home," she said, struggling to sit up. "And we never speak of this to anyone. Who would believe us anyway?" We packed up the RV that morning and drove back to Albuquerque in silence, both of us processing what had happened. Elena stared out the window at the passing landscape, occasionally pointing out features I couldn't see. Ancient roads, buried ruins, patterns in the terrain that revealed archaeological significance. "There," she said as we passed a nondescript hill about 50 miles south of Chaco. "Major ancestral Puebloan site. probably late Pueblo II period, based on the pottery scatter visible from here. I looked but saw nothing except sagebrush and rocks. You can see pottery from the highway? I can see everything now, she said quietly. It's like having X-ray vision for archaeological features. I'll never have trouble finding sites to excavate again. Over the following weeks, Elena gradually readjusted to normal life. The alien influence faded to barely perceptible whispers, and she learned to control the enhanced perceptions the builders had given her. She returned to her teaching job, but also began planning graduate research that she claimed would revolutionize southwestern archaeology. 6 months later, she defended a doctoral dissertation that identified over 200 previously unknown archaeological sites across New Mexico and Arizona. Her ability to locate buried ruins with uncanny accuracy made her famous in academic circles, though she always attributed her success to new remote sensing techniques rather than supernatural enhancement. We were married the following spring in a small ceremony at Bandelier National Monument. During the reception, as we danced under a canopy of stars, Elena whispered in my ear, "They're still out there, you know, waiting for another opportunity. But not for a long time. The astronomical alignments they need only occur every few thousand years. Are you worried they'll try again?" "No," she said, smiling. "By then, humanity will be different, more prepared, and maybe, just maybe, will be ready for what they have to offer." I pulled her closer, feeling the engagement ring press against my back where her hand rested. Whatever Elena had become during those terrible days at Chaco Canyon, she was still the woman I loved. Enhanced, yes. Changed, certainly, but fundamentally still Elena Rodriguez, archaeologist and explorer of ancient mysteries. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the stars are bright, I can see it too. The faint outline of ancient roads crossing the landscape, the subtle geometry that connects sacred sites across vast distances, the mathematical principles that govern the placement of ruins and petroglyphs and ceremonial chambers. The builders are gone, but their knowledge remains, filtering slowly into human consciousness through the woman I married. And maybe that was their plan all along. Not conquest or possession, but the gradual sharing of wisdom across the centuries. The patient teaching of an ancient curriculum to a species still learning to read the stars. Elena keeps the engagement ring in a place of honor on her desk, next to her PhD diploma and the field notebooks from our trip to Chaco Canyon. Sometimes I catch her staring at it with that distant expression that means she's seeing something I can't see, remembering things that happened in dimensions beyond normal human perception. But then she'll look up and smile, and she's just Elena again. My wife, my partner in exploration. The woman who changed everything by listening to whispers from the deep past and coming back to tell me about it. The ancient ones are patient. They'll wait, and when humanity is ready for the next convergence, perhaps we'll be wise enough to accept their gifts without losing ourselves in the process. Until then, we have each other, and we have the mysteries still waiting to be discovered in the ruins scattered across the American Southwest. Elena sees them all now, mapped in her enhanced perception like stars in an archaeological constellation, and every night when we go to sleep, I can hear her whispering to them in that ancient language, maintaining the connection, keeping the channels open for whenever humanity might be ready to listen again. The builders gave her back to me, but they kept a part of her too, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from the Gila National Forest. I'm Sarah Rodriguez, and I was 34 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The RV had been my sanctuary for 3 years. After the divorce, after losing the house, after watching my carefully constructed life crumble like sand through my fingers, that 30-foot Winnebago became everything I owned and everywhere I belonged. I'd been living in it full time, chasing seasonal work from national park to national park, and I'd grown to love the freedom it represented. No mortgage, no neighbors complaining about my music, no memories lurking in familiar corners. But I'd never been truly alone in it until that October weekend in the Gila. I'd been working the summer season at Bandelier, and with the autumn lull approaching, I decided to treat myself to some real solitude before heading south for the winter. The Gila National Forest had always called to me. All that vast wilderness, those ancient cliff dwellings, the hot springs scattered throughout the backcountry. I found a dispersed camping spot along the Middle Fork, about 15 miles from any paved road, where the Forest Service allowed RVs to park for up to 14 days. The drive-in had been beautiful but unnerving. The dirt road wound through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, climbing steadily into country that felt increasingly remote. My cell service had died about 10 miles back, and my GPS had started acting erratic around the same time, showing me positioned in empty white space on the map. I'd printed out directions from the ranger station, though, and the road markers matched what I'd written down. When I finally reached the camping area, just a widening in the road with fire rings scattered among the trees, I was the only one there. Perfect. I maneuvered the RV into position near a massive ponderosa, hooked up my water and power, and stepped outside to breathe in that high-altitude air. The silence hit me immediately. I'd camped in remote places before, but this was different. Usually, even in the deepest wilderness, you hear something. Wind in the trees, birds calling, insects buzzing, small animals rustling through the underbrush. Here, the quiet was so complete it felt solid, like a presence watching from the shadows between the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling as I set up my outdoor chair and pulled a beer from the RV's fridge. The late afternoon sun slanted through the canopy, painting everything in warm gold, and I reminded myself that this was exactly what I'd come here for. Peace, solitude, time to think without the constant hum of civilization drowning out my thoughts. But as the sun began to set, the silence grew heavier. I'd brought a Kindle full of books, a laptop with downloaded movies, enough food for a week. I'd planned to spend the evening reading by the fire, maybe do some writing in the journal I'd been neglecting. Instead, I found myself standing beside the RV, listening to that oppressive quiet, feeling increasingly uneasy. Around 8 o'clock, I decided to build a fire. The familiar routine of gathering kindling and arranging logs helped calm my nerves, and when the flames finally caught, the crackling wood provided blessed relief from the silence. I settled into my chair with Stephen King's latest, appropriately inappropriate reading material for the middle of nowhere, and tried to lose myself in someone else's fictional terrors. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the edge of my camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. I looked up from my book, heart suddenly racing, but saw nothing in the darkness between the trees. The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Not even an echo. I sat there for several minutes, every nerve on edge, but the footsteps didn't resume. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or an elk. Large animals could sound remarkably human when they walked through dry leaves and pine needles. But deer don't usually circle a camp, and the footsteps had been too regular, too measured, too purposeful. I stayed by the fire until the logs burned down to coals, then retreated into the RV and locked the door behind me. Through the windows, I could see nothing but impenetrable blackness. No stars, no moon. Thick clouds had moved in while I sat reading, and now the night felt close and suffocating. I tried to read in bed, but every small sound made me freeze. The RV settling on its jacks, the refrigerator cycling on, the wind picking up and rustling the canopy above. Or was that the wind? I found myself holding my breath, listening for those deliberate footsteps, but heard nothing except the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke to sunlight streaming through the RV's windows and felt foolish about my fears the night before. Daylight has a way of making terrors seem trivial, and as I made coffee and watched chipmunks chase each other around the massive ponderosa, the previous evening felt like nothing more than an overactive imagination fed by too much Stephen King. After breakfast, I decided to explore. I'd brought my hiking boots and day pack, and the ranger at the Gila Visitor Center had mentioned some pictographs about 3 miles up the canyon. The trail started just past my campsite, winding along the creek through stands of aspen that were just beginning to turn yellow. The hike should have been perfect. The morning air was crisp and clean, the creek babbled cheerfully over worn stones, and the canyon walls rose majestically on either side, striated in reds and oranges and browns that spoke of geological timescales beyond human comprehension. But that unnatural silence followed me up the trail. No birds, no insects. Even the creek seemed muted, its sound dampened somehow. I found the pictographs after about an hour of hiking. Ancient red and white figures painted on a sheltered rock face, depicting humans and animals and strange spirals that might have been star maps or something else entirely. I spent a long time studying them, taking photos, wondering what stories they told and what the people who painted them had experienced in this canyon. That's when I noticed the bones. They were scattered around the base of the cliff, partially hidden by fallen leaves and pine needles. At first glance, I assumed they were from deer or elk. Large leg bones, ribs, what looked like pieces of skull. But as I knelt to examine them more closely, I realized they were arranged in patterns, deliberate spirals that echoed the pictographs above. And some of them looked human. I'm no forensic expert, but I've seen enough nature documentaries to know the difference between animal and human bone structure. The skull fragments were wrong for any animal I knew, too large and rounded, with eye sockets positioned like a human's would be. One of the leg bones had that distinctive curve of a human femur. My hands were shaking as I took photos with my phone. I needed to report this to the authorities, but I had no cell service and wouldn't until I drove back toward civilization. For now, I could only document what I'd found and hope it wasn't what it appeared to be. The hike back to camp felt endless. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide watching eyes, and that oppressive silence pressed down on me like a physical weight. When I finally reached the RV, I was soaked in sweat despite the cool mountain air. I spent the afternoon trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe they were old bones from Native Americans who'd lived in the canyon centuries ago. Maybe the arrangement was natural. Water runoff or animal activity could create patterns that looked deliberate. Maybe my imagination was running wild again, seeing sinister meaning in perfectly innocent discoveries. But I couldn't shake the image of those skull fragments, or the way they'd been positioned to face the pictographs, as if watching the ancient paintings with empty sockets. As evening approached, I found myself dreading nightfall. I built another fire, made dinner, opened another beer, but my appetite was gone. The silence seemed even heavier than the night before, if that was possible, and I caught myself glancing repeatedly into the dark spaces between the trees. Around 9 o'clock, the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer, and there were more of them. I could hear at least 3 distinct sets of feet moving through the forest around my camp. They walked slowly, deliberately, maintaining perfect spacing between themselves as they circled the RV and fire pit. Sometimes they would stop for long minutes, and I would sit frozen in my chair, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, straining to see something, anything, in the impenetrable darkness beyond my small circle of firelight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. "I know you're out there. What do you want?" The footsteps stopped. For several heartbeats, the silence was complete. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins, whispering. Not words I could understand, but unmistakably human voices murmuring in the darkness. 3 distinct tones, conversing in what sounded like a language I'd never heard. The whispered conversation continued for several minutes while I sat paralyzed in my chair, then gradually faded away. The footsteps resumed, but now they were moving away from my camp, growing fainter as they retreated into the forest. Eventually, even those sounds disappeared, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the RV with every light on, checking the locks on the door and windows every few minutes, jumping at every small sound. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but determined to leave. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. But when I went outside to disconnect the RV's utilities, I found something that made my decision for me. Footprints. They circled the RV in the dirt and pine needles, just as I'd imagined the night before. But these weren't the prints of shoes or boots. They were bare feet, human-sized but somehow wrong. The toes were too long, the arches too pronounced, and they pressed deeper into the earth than seemed possible for normal human weight. More disturbing still were the symbols scratched into the dirt near my fire pit. The same spirals I'd seen in the pictographs and bone arrangements, but fresh, drawn recently in the soft earth. My hands shook as I packed up the RV. I needed to get out of here, needed to reach civilization and report what I'd found. But when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. Not even a click from the ignition. I popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. Someone, or something, had removed the battery cables and several key wires. The engine compartment looked like it had been deliberately sabotaged. Panic began to set in. I was 15 miles from the nearest paved road with no cell service and no way to drive out. My water supply would last maybe 3 days. My food, if I rationed carefully, might stretch to a week. But I couldn't stay here that long. Not with whatever was stalking me in the darkness. I packed a day pack with water, energy bars, and my phone. Then started walking. 15 miles on rough dirt road would be a long hike, but I was in decent shape, and the alternative was waiting here for whatever had been circling my camp to decide it was done playing games. The first few miles went smoothly. The morning was clear and cool, perfect for hiking, and I made good time on the winding forest road. I kept expecting to hear an engine behind me. Other campers, Forest Service personnel, anyone who could give me a ride back to civilization. But the road remained empty. Around midday, I stopped for a rest and water break. That's when I realized I was being followed. I hadn't heard anything obvious. No footsteps on the road behind me, no breaking branches in the forest. But I had that unmistakable feeling of being watched. That primitive awareness that had kept our ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats stalked through prehistoric forests. I turned around slowly, scanning the trees and underbrush on both sides of the road. For a moment, I saw nothing but pine trunks and shadows. Then movement caught my eye. A figure stood between two large ponderosas about 50 yards back, partially hidden but clearly human in shape. Tall, lean, motionless, watching me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the figure. It was too far away to make out details, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, maybe, or too thin. The limbs appeared to be disproportionately long. "Hey," I called out. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there watching me with perfect stillness that seemed somehow unnatural. I waited several minutes, but the figure remained motionless. Finally, I turned and continued walking, glancing back frequently. The figure followed, maintaining the same distance, moving only when I moved, stopping when I stopped. This continued for miles. No matter how many times I looked back, the figure was there, matching my pace, never getting closer but never falling behind. Other shapes began to appear in the forest on either side of the road. More watchers keeping pace through the trees, visible only as fleeting movements in my peripheral vision. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and increasingly desperate. I'd covered maybe 8 miles, which meant I still had 7 to go before reaching pavement. My water was running low, and the sun would set in a few hours. The thought of being caught on this road in darkness, surrounded by whatever was following me, filled me with terror. That's when I saw the ranger truck. It was parked at a widening in the road about a quarter-mile ahead, and I nearly cried with relief. A Forest Service pickup with official markings and a light bar on top. I broke into a run, waving my arms and shouting. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The truck was old, much older than anything currently in the Forest Service fleet. The paint was faded and rust-streaked, and several of the windows were broken. Tall grass grew up around the tires, and the license plates were so corroded I couldn't read them. The driver's door hung open. Inside, I could see a Forest Service uniform draped over the seat, but it was rotted and moth-eaten, as if it had been sitting there for decades. On the dashboard was a logbook, its pages yellowed and brittle. With trembling hands, I opened it and read the last entry. October 15th, 1987. Responded to report of missing campers in Middle Fork area. Found abandoned RV, signs of struggle, no trace of occupants. Something wrong here. Radio dead. Going to investigate pictograph site. If anyone finds this, don't stay after dark. They come when the sun goes down. The entry was signed by Ranger William Martinez. I staggered backward from the truck, my mind reeling. 1987. That was almost 40 years ago. And the description: abandoned RV, missing campers, signs of struggle. It was like reading about my own situation, but decades in the past. Movement in the trees around me caught my attention. The watchers were closer now, close enough that I could see them more clearly, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. They looked human at first glance, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, with limbs that stretched longer than anatomy should allow. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their faces were the worst part. Human features, but arranged slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to reconstruct human faces from memory and gotten the details just a little bit off. Eyes that were too large, mouths that were too wide, expressions that were too knowing. There were at least a dozen of them now, standing motionless among the trees, watching me with those terrible eyes. And behind them, barely visible in the deeper shadows, I could see more shapes moving. Many more. I ran. I dropped my day pack and ran down that dirt road like all the demons of hell were chasing me, which maybe they were. Behind me, I could hear them moving through the forest, keeping pace effortlessly, their long limbs carrying them through the underbrush with rustling sounds that weren't quite right. The sun was setting, painting the sky blood red between the trees, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had to reach pavement before full darkness fell. Whatever these things were, they'd been playing with me so far, but night was their time. Night was when they stopped playing. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I kept running. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, winding through the forest like a nightmare version of a recurring dream. Every time I thought I glimpsed pavement in the distance, it turned out to be just another bend in the dirt road. Full darkness fell when I was still miles from civilization. That's when the real horror began. They emerged from the trees like something out of a fever dream. Those impossible tall figures with their wrong faces and knowing eyes. They moved onto the road ahead of me and behind me, cutting off my escape, surrounding me with a circle of pale bodies that gleamed faintly in the starlight. I stopped running. There was nowhere left to go. They stood there watching me, perhaps 20 of them now, their heads tilted at unnatural angles like curious birds. Their mouths were moving, and I realized they were whispering again in that strange language I'd heard at my campsite. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, a susurrus of inhuman voices that made my skin crawl. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, its limbs even more elongated. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through dry leaves. "You found the bones," it said in perfectly clear English. "You saw the pictures. You know what we are." I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything but stand there frozen like a deer in headlights. But my body wouldn't obey. I could only stare at that impossible face and listen to words that should have been comforting in their familiarity, but were terrifying instead. "We've been waiting," it continued. "Waiting and watching and preparing. The old stories call us many names, but you can call us the quiet ones. We live in the spaces between sounds, in the silence that makes humans uncomfortable. We've been here much longer than your kind. What do you want?" I managed to whisper. The thing that might have been smiling, though its mouth was too wide for the expression to look right. Want. "We want what we've always wanted, to be left alone. But your kind keeps coming into our places, making noise, disturbing the peace we've cultivated for centuries. So we take some of you, not many, just enough to maintain the balance." I thought of the bones arranged in spirals, of Ranger Martinez's logbook entry, of all the missing persons reports that must exist in Forest Service files. You kill people. Sometimes. But mostly we just change them, make them quiet like us. The ranger whose truck you found, he's one of ours now. Has been for decades. He helps us sometimes when we need someone who remembers how to interact with your kind. Around the circle, the other figures began to move closer, their whispered conversation growing louder. I could feel their intent like a physical pressure, the weight of predators who had finally decided to stop playing with their prey. "Please," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was pleading for. "I'll leave. I won't tell anyone about this place. I'll never come back." The tall one's head tilted even further, almost completely sideways now. "But you've already seen too much, and you've been here too long. The silence has touched you. Can't you feel it? The way sounds seem muted now. The way your own voice sounds strange in your ears." It was right. I could feel it, had been feeling it since my first night in the canyon. The world seemed wrapped in cotton, all sounds dampened and distant. Even my heartbeat sounded far away. "You're becoming one of us already," the thing said with something that might have been satisfaction. "The process started the moment you entered our territory. A few more days, and the change will be complete. You'll forget about the outside world, forget about noise and chaos and the constant chatter of human civilization. You'll find peace in the quiet." The circle was closing now, those pale figures reaching toward me with hands that had too many joints in the fingers. I tried to scream, but only a whisper emerged from my throat. That's when the headlights appeared. Twin beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the circle of pale figures and causing them to freeze like startled animals. An engine roared to life somewhere behind me, growing rapidly louder as it approached. The quiet ones hissed in unison, a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe. The tall one turned its terrible face toward the approaching vehicle and snarled something in that alien language. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they melted back into the forest, vanishing between the trees like smoke. The vehicle, a modern Forest Service truck with working headlights and a functioning engine, pulled up beside me. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a middle-aged Hispanic man in a ranger uniform. "Ma'am, are you all right? We got a call about an abandoned RV up the road." I wanted to tell him about the quiet ones, about the bones and the whispers and the terrible figures with their wrong faces. But when I opened my mouth, only a whisper came out. The silence had taken my voice, just as they'd promised. The ranger, his name tag read Sanchez, helped me into the truck and drove me back toward civilization. I tried to explain what had happened, but my voice remained a whisper, and he clearly thought I was suffering from dehydration and exposure. He took me to the hospital in Silver City, where doctors found nothing physically wrong with me except exhaustion. My RV was recovered the next day. The engine had been repaired, someone had reconnected all the sabotaged wiring, and there was no sign of the footprints or symbols I'd seen in the dirt. The Forest Service attributed the mechanical problems to vandalism, possibly by the same people who'd made the call reporting my abandoned campsite. But I know the truth. The quiet ones let me go, but they didn't let me go unchanged. My voice never fully returned. I speak in whispers now, and sometimes, in the deepest silence of night, I can hear them calling to me from the spaces between sounds. They're patient. They know I'll come back eventually, drawn by the promise of perfect quiet, of peace from the constant noise of human existence. The silence they touched me with grows stronger every day, making the ordinary sounds of civilization seem harsh and intrusive. I still live in my RV, but I don't travel to remote places anymore. I stay in RV parks and campgrounds, surrounded by the comforting noise of other people. But sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I find myself planning routes back to the Gila, calculating how long it would take to reach that quiet canyon where the quiet ones wait. The change isn't complete yet, but I can feel it progressing. Soon, I think, the silence will claim me entirely, and maybe that won't be such a terrible thing. Maybe perfect quiet is exactly what I've been searching for all along. Until then, I write these words as a warning. Stay away from the Middle Fork area of the Gila National Forest. Don't camp alone in the deep woods. And if you hear whispers in a language you don't recognize, if you see tall figures watching from between the trees, if the silence becomes so heavy it feels alive, run. Run, and don't look back. and pray they're not ready to stop playing games. Because in the end, we all become quiet.